The morning mist clung to the Maryland countryside like a shroud as Private Barton Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Infantry bent down to retrieve what appeared to be discarded paper near an abandoned Confederate campsite. It was September 13th, 1862, and the young soldier had no idea that the 3 cigars wrapped in official-looking documents would change the course of American history forever. As Mitchell unfolded the papers, his eyes widened in disbelief. Before him lay Robert Edward Lee's complete battle plans for the Army of Northern Virginia Special Order 191, detailing every movement, every division's position, and every strategic objective of the Confederate invasion of Maryland. The discovery seemed too incredible to be real, yet there it was, written in the unmistakable hand of Lee's adjutant, Robert Chilton. Within hours, the lost orders had traveled up the chain of command to Major General George Brinton McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan, typically cautious and methodical, felt his pulse quicken as he studied the intelligence windfall. For once in his military career, he held all the cards. Lee's army was dangerously divided, scattered across western Maryland in multiple columns, vulnerable to defeat in detail. "Here's a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home," McClellan declared to his staff, his usual hesitation replaced by uncharacteristic confidence. The Army of the Potomac, numbering over 87,000 men, suddenly possessed the advantage that had eluded Union commanders since the war's beginning. Lee's audacious Maryland campaign had begun with high hopes. Following his stunning victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run, the Confederate general had convinced President Jefferson Davis to authorize an invasion of the North. The strategic objectives were ambitious: shift the war away from war-torn Virginia, potentially gain European recognition for the Confederacy, and perhaps influence Northern public opinion ahead of the midterm elections. According to detailed accounts preserved in the National Archives, Lee's army crossed the Potomac River on September 4th, 1862, with approximately 55,000 troops, though many were barefoot, hungry, and exhausted from continuous campaigning. The Confederate strategy required precise coordination. Lee had divided his forces, sending Major General Thomas Jonathan "Stonewall" Jackson with 3 divisions to capture the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, while the rest of the army would concentrate near Hagerstown. It was a calculated risk that depended entirely on secrecy and timing. Now, with his plans exposed, Lee faced potential disaster. Union cavalry scouts reported McClellan's army advancing with unusual speed and purpose through the gaps in South Mountain. The Confederate commander realized his perilous situation. His army was scattered. Jackson was still besieging Harper's Ferry, and the Army of the Potomac was moving to exploit his vulnerability. As the sun set on September 13th, both armies prepared for what would become the bloodiest single day in American military history. Lee began the desperate process of concentrating his divided forces near the small Maryland town of Sharpsburg, while McClellan's columns pressed forward. Sensing victory within their grasp, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Lee's invasion, but potentially the entire war itself. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Sharpsburg, Maryland, on September 17, 1862. As two great armies faced each other across Antietam Creek, Robert Edward Lee had managed to concentrate most of his Army of Northern Virginia along a defensive ridge overlooking the sleepy farming community. But his position remained precarious, with the Potomac River at his back and only 40,000 troops immediately available. He was vastly outnumbered by McClellan's approaching forces. The Confederate line stretched nearly for miles, from the Dunker Church in the north to Antietam Creek in the south. Lee positioned his forces with desperate efficiency. Major General Daniel Harvey Hill's division held the center along the Hagerstown Pike, while Brigadier General John Bell Hood's exhausted Texans anchored the left flank near the church. To the south, the stone Rohrbach Bridge, soon to be forever known as Burnside Bridge, represented the Army's most vulnerable point. McClellan's battle plan, despite his intelligence advantage, reflected his characteristic complexity and caution. Rather than concentrating his overwhelming numerical superiority for a decisive blow, He chose to attack in 3 separate phases. Major General Joseph Hooker's 1st Corps would assault the Confederate left at dawn, followed by attacks on the center and right throughout the day. It was a methodical approach that would squander his greatest opportunity. As the first streaks of sunlight pierced the morning darkness, Hooker's artillery opened fire from positions north of Sharpsburg. The thunderous bombardment shattered the pastoral silence, sending Confederate soldiers scrambling for cover among the corn rows and rail fences that crisscrossed the battlefield. The Battle of Antietam had begun. Brigadier General Abner Doubleday's division advanced first, their blue uniforms creating long lines across the Miller Farm's 30-acre cornfield. The corn stood tall and thick, nearly ready for harvest, creating a natural maze that would soon become a killing field. Confederate defenders, positioned behind the Hagerstown Pikes rail fences, waited with practiced patience as the Union soldiers approached. Detailed battlefield reports, preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, describe the cornfield as standing nearly 6 feet high, creating perfect concealment for both attacking and defending forces. The fighting in the cornfield erupted with shocking violence. Volleys of musket fire crashed back and forth as blue and gray lines surged through the maze of stalks. The 1st Texas Infantry, commanded by Colonel Philip Work, fought with desperate ferocity, knowing that Hood's entire division depended on their ability to hold the line. Union soldiers fell in horrifying numbers, their bodies marking the tide of each unsuccessful advance. Major General Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps joined the assault, but the elderly commander fell mortally wounded within minutes of engaging. The enemy, Brigadier General Alpheus Williams, assumed command, pressing his Connecticut and Pennsylvania regiments forward through the hellish cornfield. The corn stalks, green and promising just hours before, were now trampled and stained crimson with the blood of hundreds of casualties. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the cornfield had changed hands multiple times. Confederate reinforcements from Major General John Grubb Walker's division arrived, just as Union forces threatened to break through entirely. The battle swayed back and forth with each fresh assault, creating a tactical stalemate that consumed lives at an appalling rate. Near the Dunker Church, a small white building that had served the local German Baptist community for decades, Hood's Texans made their final stand. These veterans of Peninsula Campaign and Second Bull Run fought with the knowledge that Lee's entire left flank depended on their resistance. When ammunition ran low, they fixed bayonets and prepared for hand-to-hand combat. As the morning wore on, the cost of the northern assault became clear. Both sides had suffered enormous casualties for minimal territorial gain, and McClellan's 1st phase had failed to achieve its objectives. The day was still young, but already the fields around Sharpsburg were littered with the dead and wounded from both armies. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the focus of battle shifted southward to the center of Lee's defensive line, where Daniel Harvey Hill's division occupied a natural trench formation that local farmers called the Sunken Road. This ancient farm lane, worn down by decades of wagon traffic and erosion, would soon earn a more sinister name in American military history: the Bloody Lane. Major General William Henry French's division approached the Confederate center with characteristic Union confidence. French, a career soldier with 30 years of service, had positioned his 3 brigades in traditional linear formation, expecting to overwhelm Hill's outnumbered defenders. Through sheer force of numbers, the mathematics seemed favorable. Nearly 6,000 Union troops advancing against fewer than 2,500 Confederates. Hill's men had prepared their position with the experienced eye of veteran soldiers. The 2nd and 6th North Carolina regiments, commanded by Colonel Charles Colquitt Gardner, took cover behind the Sunken Road's natural earthworks. To their right, the 3rd Alabama Infantry under Colonel Cullen Andrews' battle formed the anchor of the defensive line. These troops had marched nearly 600 miles since leaving Richmond, but their morale remained high despite their exhaustion. The initial Union assault began with devastating artillery fire from Captain Joseph Knapp's Pennsylvania battery. Confederate soldiers pressed themselves against the earthen walls of the Sunken Road as cannonballs screamed overhead, exploding among the reserve formations positioned behind their lines. The bombardment created a terrifying prelude to the infantry attack that everyone knew must follow. Brigadier General Max Weber's brigade advanced first, their Pennsylvania and New York regiments moving across the open field between the Roulette Farm and the Confederate position. The morning sun glinted off thousands of bayonets as the blue lines approached, drums beating the steady cadence that had become the soundtrack of Civil War battles. Confederate defenders held their fire, waiting for their opponents to reach optimal range. Contemporary accounts from soldiers' diaries and letters, preserved in various state historical societies, describe the eerie silence that preceded the Confederate volley, broken only by the sound of marching feet and occasional artillery bursts. At 150 yards, Hill gave the command that his regimental commanders had been waiting for. The sunken road erupted in smoke and flame as hundreds of Confederate muskets fired simultaneously. The devastating volley struck Weber's advancing ranks like a scythe, dropping entire companies in seconds. Union soldiers who survived the initial fire found themselves pinned down in the open field, unable to advance or retreat. French committed his 2nd Brigade under Brigadier General Dwight Morris, but the results proved equally catastrophic. The North Carolina and Alabama regiments had perfected their firing technique, delivering coordinated volleys every 30 seconds with mechanical precision. Union casualties mounted at an appalling rate as successive waves of blue uniformed soldiers attempted to cross the killing ground. The 3rd assault came from Brigadier General Nathan Kimball's brigade, including the famous Irish Brigade of New York. These immigrant soldiers, many recent rivals from the potato famine, advanced with their distinctive green flags and passionate battle cries. Their courage was unquestionable, but courage alone could not overcome the tactical advantages held by Hill's defenders. For nearly 2 hours, the fighting raged around the sunken road with unprecedented intensity. Confederate ammunition began running low, forcing soldiers to scavenge cartridges from fallen comrades. Union reinforcements continued arriving, including Major General Israel Bush Richardson's division. But the natural strength of Hill's position seemed impregnable. The turning point came through a combination of tactical error and extraordinary courage. As Richardson's men flanked the Confederate right, Colonel Battle's 3rd Alabama found itself caught in a crossfire. Simultaneously, a misunderstood order caused the 6th North Carolina to begin withdrawing from their position, creating a gap in the defensive line that Union soldiers quickly exploited. Within minutes, the careful Confederate formation collapsed. Union troops poured through the breakthrough, forcing Hill's survivors to abandon the sunken road they had defended so successfully. As blue-uniformed soldiers occupied the position, they encountered a sight that would haunt their memories forever. The road was literally filled with Confederate dead, lying so thick that, according to one witness, a person could walk its entire length without touching the ground. While the carnage continued around the bloody lane, the day's 3rd major engagement was developing 3 miles to the south, where Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside faced one of the most challenging tactical problems of the entire war. His 9th Corps, numbering over 12,000 men, had been tasked with crossing Antietam Creek via a narrow stone bridge, defended by a handful of Georgian sharpshooters positioned on the heights above the Rohrbach Bridge. As local residents called it, spanned Antietam Creek at its narrowest point, creating a natural bottleneck that favored defenders enormously. The stone structure, built in 1836 by local craftsmen, measured only 120 feet in length and 12 feet in width, space enough for perhaps 8 men walking abreast. Confederate engineers could not have designed a better defensive position. If they had tried, Brigadier General Robert Augustus Toombs commanded the Georgian defenders, including the 2nd and 20th Georgia Infantry Regiments. These veteran troops, numbering fewer than 400 men, occupied nearly impregnable positions among the limestone outcroppings that overlooked the bridge approach. Their orders from Lee were simple: hold the crossing at all costs and prevent Burnside from flanking the Confederate right. Burnside's initial assault plan reflected both the tactical complexity of his situation and his personal limitations as a field commander. Rather than attempting to force the bridge directly, He ordered Brigadier General Isaac Peace Rodman's division to search for a downstream ford, while Brigadier General Jacob Dolson Cox prepared to assault the Stone Crossing. The coordination between these simultaneous movements would prove challenging. Military historians studying the official records have noted that Burnside possessed detailed maps showing multiple ford locations along Antietam Creek, yet he seemed fixated on the bridge crossing despite its obvious tactical disadvantages. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Colonel George Crook's Ohio Brigade made the first attempt to storm the bridge. The 11th Connecticut Infantry, led by Colonel Henry Walter Kingsbury, advanced in column formation across the narrow stone span while Georgian riflemen waited in concealed positions. The result was predictably catastrophic. Kingsbury fell mortally wounded within seconds, and his entire regiment was forced to retreat under withering fire. The second assault came 2 hours later, led by the 2nd Maryland Infantry and 6th New Hampshire Regiments. These troops attempted to provide covering fire for their advancing comrades, but the Confederate position remained virtually impregnable. Toombs Georgians had positioned themselves to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any Union soldiers who survived the approach to the bridge would face devastating crossfire from multiple directions. Burnside's frustration mounted as precious hours passed without progress. McClellan's battle plan called for the 9th Corps to cross Antietam Creek and threaten Lee's right flank by early afternoon, but the stone bridge continued to resist all attempts at capture. Meanwhile, Confederate artillery from Major John Pelham's horse batteries added to the Union difficulties by enfilading the bridge approaches. With accurate cannon fire, the breakthrough finally came at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when the 51st New York Infantry and 51st Pennsylvania Infantry launched a coordinated assault under Colonel Robert Brown Potter. These regiments had studied the previous failed attempts and developed a more sophisticated tactical approach. While one battalion provided suppressing fire from positions along the creek bank, assault columns rushed the bridge from multiple angles. Sergeant Ellis Hamilton of the 51st New York was among the first Union soldiers to reach the western end of the bridge, where he planted the regimental colors despite intense Confederate fire. His courage inspired the entire assault force, and within minutes, blue-uniformed soldiers were pouring across the stone span that had resisted capture for nearly 4 hours. Toombs realized that his small force could no longer hold their position. Against overwhelming numbers, the Georgian regiments began a fighting withdrawal toward Sharpsburg, using stone walls and farm buildings to slow the Union advance. Their tactical success had been remarkable. Fewer than 400 Confederate soldiers had delayed over 12,000 Union troops for the better part of a day. As Burnside's corps finally established itself on the western side of Antietam Creek, the tactical situation on Lee's right flank became desperate. With Hill's center broken and the 9th Corps threatening his line of retreat, the Confederate commander faced the possibility of complete defeat. The afternoon phase of the Battle of Antietam was about to begin, and Lee's army hung by the thinnest of threads. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Robert Edward Lee faced the gravest crisis of his military career. His Army of Northern Virginia was bloodied, outnumbered, and pressed on 3 sides by McClellan's relentless attacks. The center had collapsed at the Bloody Lane. The left flank remained under pressure near the Dunker Church, and now Burnside's entire 9th Corps was advancing from the south, threatening to cut off the Confederate line of retreat to the Potomac River. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's division remained at Harper's Ferry, 17 miles away, still engaged in the final stages of capturing the Union garrison there. Lee had dispatched desperate messages throughout the morning, urging his subordinate to complete the operation and march immediately to Sharpsburg. Without Hill's reinforcements, the Army of Northern Virginia faced potential annihilation before sunset. Burnside's single quotes S advance from the bridge proceeded with methodical determination. His 4 divisions, now properly deployed on the western side of Antietam Creek, outnumbered the remaining Confederate defenders by nearly 4-to-1. Brigadier General Orlando Bolivar Wilcox's division led the assault, followed by Brigadier General Samuel Davis Sturgis and the arriving elements of Rodman's command. The Confederate defenders facing this overwhelming force consisted primarily of Brigadier General David Rumph Jones's division, already weakened by the morning's casualties and stretched thin across nearly 2 miles of front. Jones positioned his South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia regiments behind stone walls and farm buildings, knowing that their small numbers could only delay, not stop, the approaching Union juggernaut. As Burnside's blue columns advanced across the rolling farmland south of Sharpsburg, Confederate artillery attempted to slow their progress. Major Mathis Webster Henry's batteries, positioned on Cemetery Hill overlooking the town, fired rapidly at the approaching formations, but ammunition was running critically low. Each artillery round had to count, as no resupply would be possible until the battle's conclusion. Battlefield correspondence preserved in the Robert E. Lee papers at Washington and Lee University reveals the Confederate commander's growing desperation as he watched Union forces converge on his positions from multiple directions. The Union advance achieved steady progress against weakening Confederate resistance. The 9th, 11th, and 16th Connecticut Infantry Regiments, supported by Rhode Island and New York units, pushed through the scattered defensive positions with growing confidence. For the first time during the entire Maryland campaign, Lee's army appeared to be on the verge of complete collapse. In Sharpsburg itself, Confederate wagons and ambulances clogged the narrow streets as wounded soldiers and military supplies prepared for what seemed like inevitable retreat. Lee established his final command post on Cemetery Hill, where he could observe the entire battlefield and coordinate the Army's last desperate defensive efforts. Staff officers prepared contingency plans for withdrawal across the Potomac, though such a movement under enemy pressure would be extremely hazardous. At 4 o'clock, Burnside's assault reached its maximum intensity. Union soldiers advanced to within 400 yards of Sharpsburg's outskirts, threatening to capture the town and cut the Confederate Army's primary retreat route. Jones's defenders fought with the courage of desperation, but their ammunition was nearly exhausted and casualties had reduced many regiments to company strength. Just as Confederate collapse seemed imminent, salvation appeared from an unexpected direction. A long column of dust rising from the Harper's Ferry Road caught Lee's attention through his field glasses. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's division was arriving at the critical moment, having completed a grueling 17-mile forced march. In less than 8 hours, Hill's lead brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg, deployed immediately into line of battle without pause for rest or reorganization. The South Carolina regiments, recognizable by their distinctive red battle shirts, struck Burnside's exposed right flank with devastating effect. Union soldiers, who had been advancing confidently toward Sharpsburg, suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. The psychological impact of Hill's arrival exceeded even its tactical significance. Confederate defenders, who had been preparing for surrender or retreat, suddenly renewed their resistance with fierce determination. Meanwhile, Union commanders, surprised by the fresh Confederate troops, began to question whether their intelligence regarding enemy strength had been accurate. Brigadier General Isaac Rodman, attempting to extend the Union line to counter Hill's flanking movement, fell mortally wounded while positioning his troops. His division, deprived of leadership at the critical moment, began to waver under the intense Confederate counterattack. The momentum of Burnside's assault, which had seemed unstoppable just minutes before, ground to a halt as Hill's reinforcements restored the tactical balance. As evening approached, both armies faced a moment of decision that would determine the battle's ultimate outcome and potentially the war's future direction. The arrival of Ambrose Powell Hill's division transformed the tactical situation at Antietam from impending Confederate disaster to desperate stalemate. Hill's soldiers, exhausted from their forced march from Harper's Ferry, nonetheless attacked Burnside's exposed flank with the ferocity that had made them legendary. Throughout the Army of Northern Virginia, the red battle shirts of the South Carolina brigades became a rallying point for Confederate forces. Across the entire southern portion of the battlefield, Brigadier General Lawrence O'Brien Branch's North Carolina brigade struck first, hitting the 16th Connecticut Infantry just as they approached Sharpsburg's outskirts. The Connecticut soldiers, who had advanced nearly 2 miles from Antietam Creek with minimal opposition, suddenly found themselves under intense fire from fresh Confederate troops. Positioned in unexpected locations, Colonel Francis Beech's regiment, which had been preparing to enter the town itself, was forced into hasty defensive positions behind stone walls and farm buildings. The psychological shock of Hill's intervention rippled through Burnside's entire corps. Union soldiers who had been advancing with growing confidence suddenly questioned whether they faced a trap rather than a Confederate retreat. Reports of fresh enemy troops reached regimental and brigade commanders, creating confusion about the true strength of Lee's remaining forces. Hill personally led the counterattack, his distinctive red battle shirt making him easily recognizable to both friend and enemy. The Confederate general had earned his reputation as Lee's most aggressive division commander through precisely this kind of dramatic intervention at critical moments. His soldiers responded to his leadership with desperate courage, knowing that their army's survival depended on stopping the Union advance. Before darkness fell, personal accounts from Hill's staff officers, preserved in various regimental histories, describe the general's exhaustion after the 17-mile march, yet his determination to launch an immediate counterattack. Without allowing his troops any rest, Burnside faced a critical decision as reports of the Confederate counterattack reached his headquarters. His corps had suffered significant casualties during the bridge assault and subsequent advance, and his ammunition supplies were running low after hours of continuous fighting. The unexpected appearance of Hill's division raised questions about whether other Confederate reinforcements might be approaching. The Union commander chose caution over aggression, ordering his divisions to establish defensive positions rather than continue the advance toward Sharpsburg. This decision, though tactically prudent given the circumstances, effectively ended the Union Army's best opportunity to achieve decisive victory at Antietam. Hill's timely intervention had saved Lee's army from potential destruction. As the afternoon progressed, sporadic fighting continued along the southern portion of the battlefield, but neither side possessed the strength for sustained offensive operations. Confederate ammunition was critically low, while Union forces had been weakened by the day's casualties and the psychological impact of Hill's surprise attack. The battle gradually evolved into a series of isolated skirmishes between exhausted opponents. McClellan, observing the situation from his command post east of Antietam Creek, made the fateful decision to end major offensive operations for the day. Despite possessing nearly 20,000 fresh troops who had not participated in the fighting, he chose not to commit these reserves to exploit the tactical opportunities that remained available. His characteristic caution, which had defined his entire military career, once again prevented him from achieving decisive results. Lee used the respite to consolidate his battered forces and prepare for potential renewed Union attacks on September 18th. His army had suffered enormous casualties, nearly 25% of its total strength, but remained intact as a fighting force. The Confederate commander faced a strategic dilemma: withdraw across the Potomac immediately, or maintain his position for one more day to demonstrate that his invasion had not been completely defeated. As sunset approached on September 17, 1862, both armies counted their enormous losses from what had become the bloodiest single day in American military history. The Battle of Antietam had lasted nearly 12 hours, consuming lives at a rate unprecedented in the Western Hemisphere. Yet despite the tactical inconclusive nature of the fighting, the strategic implications of the day's events would reshape the entire course of the Civil War. The Union Army had failed to destroy Lee's forces, but it had successfully ended the Confederate invasion of Maryland. McClellan's victory, though incomplete, would provide President Abraham Lincoln with the political cover necessary to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, fundamentally altering the war's purpose and preventing European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. September 18th dawned gray and somber over the battlefield at Antietam, where 23,000 American casualties bore witness to the previous day's unprecedented carnage. The morning mist that had concealed the armies 24 hours earlier now revealed the true cost of what would be remembered as the bloodiest single day in the nation's history. Robert Edward Lee spent the pre-dawn hours walking among his devastated regiments, assessing the true condition of his Army of Northern Virginia. Entire brigades had been reduced to the size of companies, and many of his most experienced officers lay among the dead scattered across the Maryland countryside. Major General Daniel Harvey Hill's division had been virtually destroyed defending the Bloody Lane, while Hood's Texas Brigade numbered fewer than 400 survivors from the 1,000 men who had entered battle. The Confederate commander faced an agonizing decision that would define both his military reputation and the war's future trajectory. His army, though still occupying defensive positions around Sharpsburg, was in no condition to resume offensive operations. Ammunition was critically short, medical supplies were exhausted, and many soldiers lacked basic equipment lost during the retreat from South Mountain and the subsequent battle. McClellan, meanwhile, maintained his characteristic caution despite possessing overwhelming numerical superiority. His Army of the Potomac had suffered 12,000 casualties, but nearly 20,000 fresh troops remained uncommitted from the previous day's fighting. Conservative by nature and consistently prone to overestimating enemy strength, the Union commander chose to probe Confederate positions rather than launch decisive attacks. Throughout the morning of September 18th, both armies engaged in tentative skirmishing while their commanders evaluated tactical options. Confederate artillery, reduced to fewer than 20 operational cannons, attempted to mask the Army's weakness through occasional bombardments of Union positions. Federal batteries responded methodically, but McClellan had forbidden any major infantry movements without his direct authorization. Military dispatches preserved in the McClellan Papers at the Library of Congress reveal the Union commander's continued belief that Lee possessed significant reserves, despite clear intelligence indicating Confederate weakness. Lee's council of war that afternoon included his surviving division commanders, James Longstreet, whose steady leadership had anchored the Confederate center, Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, whose late rival from Harper's Ferry had prevented complete disaster, and Ambrose Powell Hill, whose timely intervention had saved the Army from destruction. The consensus was unanimous. The Army of Northern Virginia must withdraw across the Potomac River. Before McClellan gathered sufficient courage to resume his attacks, the Confederate withdrawal began at sunset on September 18th, conducted with the professional skill that had characterized Lee's army throughout the war. Longstreet's corps served as the rear guard, maintaining defensive positions around Sharpsburg while Jackson's and Hill's divisions crossed at Blackford's Ford near Shepherdstown. The movement was completed by dawn on September 19th, bringing the Maryland campaign to its conclusion. McClellan's pursuit was characteristically tentative. Union cavalry reached the abandoned Confederate positions round noon on September 19th, but the main army remained east of Antietam Creek. The Federal commander, despite overwhelming pressure from Washington to pursue and destroy Lee's weakened forces, chose to reorganize and resupply his army rather than attempt immediate pursuit across the Potomac. The Battle of Antietam's strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Lee's invasion of Maryland had been decisively repulsed, eliminating Confederate hopes for European recognition and intervention. More significantly, the Union victory provided President Abraham Lincoln with the political capital necessary to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. The proclamation fundamentally transformed the war's purpose from preserving the Union to abolishing slavery, making European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy politically impossible. Great Britain and France, both strongly opposed to slavery, could no longer consider recognizing Confederate independence without appearing to support human bondage. For McClellan, Antietam represented both his greatest victory and his ultimate failure as a military commander. He had successfully defended the Union against Lee's invasion and inflicted enormous casualties on the Army of Northern Virginia. Yet his failure to pursue and destroy Lee's weakened forces meant that the war would continue for nearly 3 more years at enormous cost in human life. The Battle of Antietam established the template for much of the remaining Civil War. Union armies would possess overwhelming material advantages, but Confederate forces would continue fighting with skill and determination. Despite increasingly desperate circumstances, the single bloodiest day in American military history had ended Confederate hopes for quick victory. But it had not ended Confederate resistance. As the wounded from both armies filled hospitals throughout Maryland and Virginia, the American people began to comprehend the true cost of preserving their Union. The Battle of Antietam had saved Lincoln's presidency and the Union cause, but it had also demonstrated that victory would require unprecedented sacrifice from an entire generation of Americans. The struggle for the nation's soul would continue, but after Antietam, its ultimate outcome was no longer in doubt.